Bringing a fresh new perspective on the challenges and issues that face our criminal justice system and their impact on all New Yorkers, this is Justice Matters with your host, President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association, Patrick Cullen.
Good afternoon to all listeners here on AM 970 The Answer. My name is Patrick Cullen, and I am the President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to Justice Matters, a show that highlights the very important role court officers play in maintaining and providing safety and security in our courts throughout New York City and the 9th Judicial District. As I do every week, I'd like to start by touching on a couple of issues and developments that have happened in the past week. Many of you may have seen a New York Post article last week regarding security lapses in our courthouses. If you have not seen the Post, it is on our website, nysscoa.org, and I urge you all to read this article. And the article focuses on a recent incident in which an individual was found in an unauthorized area of the Supreme Court in Bronx County. This particular unauthorized area houses the chambers of our Supreme Court justices. Many would say, well, how on earth did that happen? Weren't there court officers present to prevent a person from entering such a sensitive area? The simple answer is no, there were not. For too lengthy a period of time now, the Office of Court Administration here in New York has found it acceptable to allow our court facilities to open and in some instances close without security personnel present. Under this policy, custodial staff employed by the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services is tasked with unlocking the doors of court facilities when they arrive to perform their duties by 6 a.m. in order to ensure that courthouse facilities are prepared for the thousands of members of the public who will enter during any given day. The problem here is that these are city employees who have a long list of tasks to complete, but more importantly, they are not trained court officers. They unlock the building, leaving entrances unmanned for anyone to walk in before security is even in the facility. It sounds like a major problem, right? It is. It is unconscionable for the Office of Court Administration to cut staffing to save on overtime and to cut mobile security patrols, which serve to help prevent this exact sort of thing. So when called upon about this report, the response from the Office of Court Administration was to immediately assign officers to this building to prevent similar lapses from occurring forthwith. Here is the problem. This is happening all over New York City in our courts. Unauthorized individuals are discovered regularly due to this cost-saving policy the court system has taken. Yet, when a news report surfaces, it is immediately addressed. That is the exact type of reactionary behavior that will at some point create a tragedy. All New York City courts need to be manned by court officers at the moment the doors are unlocked. Public safety depends on it. Rest assured, our union, the SCOA, is working on educating our employer on just how dangerous this condition continues to be, and we demand personnel be present every single morning. Our first guest this week is Mike Karubi, president of the Subway Surface Supervisors Association. Mike, welcome to Justice Matters.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. Before we get to begin about some of the issues your members are facing and how somehow, in a lot of ways it relates to my members, tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to our listeners, and, where you grew up and how you find yourself as the president of your union now.
Well, as Pat said, I'm the president of the SSA. I've been president since 2015, March of 2015. I grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn. My father was a civil servant. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, like most parents back in those days. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy. I have two sisters. One is both of them are civil servants. My baby sister is the county supervisor for court reporters. My other sister is a bus driver. I have my family has a history of civil service, whether it be MTA, whether it be outside other agencies within the city of New York.
Right.
I grew up, like most immigrant families, poor, struggling. But my parents instilled in me that, listen, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be a lawyer or a doctor. There was no money to do that. So the best way to go was to take a city test, and I did so.
Yeah, it's a familiar story between, so many of us who serve on union boards and the people we represent and, the people we grew up next to. You didn't grow up in Flatbush, the grandson of immigrants and hardworking parents with millionaires next door. Everybody was in the same boat, right?
That is correct. Most of my friends that went to school, we were all in the same boat. We had holes in our shoes and ripped pants when we went to school.
Yeah, my own grandfather was an immigrant from Ireland and became a bus driver in the Bronx. So, it all relates in the same circles over time. And this story is so familiar, but it's always so important to tell because we cannot let our members be overlooked for the work they do. So how'd you get, once you get started in your career, how'd you move on and wind up running the union now?
I actually took a test to become a conductor on a train. Back in 1989, I was hired as a conductor for the New York City Transit. After a couple of years being disciplined a couple of times by the transit authority and almost lost my job, and I had a young wife at home, a young child at home, and I knew I needed to pay my bills and pay my rent.
Sure.
I almost lost my job. So I got myself involved right away with the union. At the time was TW Local 100.
Right.
Grew and progressed through the ranks of the TWU, division chairman, acting vice president, and after time I ran a couple of times for union office, higher office for president of them. Well, of course, we didn't make it. It wasn't an easy task.
Right.
Back in 2007, I took the promotion to supervisor in New York City Transit. Waited about 4 years and became a vice president for that union. And then in 2014, I chose to run for president of this union. And in 2015, I took office.
That's a really wonderful story in a way because you saw firsthand the necessity of how important being a active member of the union was because it helped you out in a tough spot. And I think there's a number of people, if you listen to their stories, you'll hear the same thing. I actually had to rely on the union, and that's why I got involved with it. Or something really affected my workplace, and I had to go get involved with it. And so that story is also one that's told often. So who does the SSSA represent, and what do your members do in service to New York City?
Okay, we represent, including Staten Island, all New York City supervisors, line supervisors, foremans, and also SATOA in Staten Island. We just organized them, supervisors out there. What we do is actually we supervise the TW Local 100 hourlies, the train operators, conductors, bus operators, track workers. That's our day-to-day operation. We supervise or foreman those hourlies.
So you just recently brought a group on, organized a new group to join under the umbrella of SSSA.
Yes, we did. In 2016, we were successful in organizing the Staten Island Rapid Transit supervisors. And we're still moving forward with other organizations, other members out there as well. That's
terrific, Mike, because we all know that organized labor is under attack throughout this country. New York is a labor town; it's an organized, it's a union town. I don't think that'll ever change. And to hear, stories like that of existing unions organizing more members, it breathes life into what is a tough job for all of us. Running unions is not easy. And being involved with them is not easy. But to hear that is really refreshing. That people are still out there. People, you've got 30 some odd years in the system. You're out there still trying to get people to buy into what labor's about and bring in new members. That's really terrific.
Yes.
Some of our listeners may wonder why I a show dedicated to justice that I reference often transit. And I think that they are directly related in two ways, and so I want to draw that correlation before we move on a little bit. Number one, our jurors travel often by public transit to the courthouses, and if a juror is late, justice is delayed, right? And public transportation in New York City has a direct quality of work life for our members. So many of our members rely on public transportation to get to work. If the buses and trains aren't running properly, they may face discipline So just speak to that responsibility and how you guys kind of take that on and how important that is to you.
Yes, Pat. A lot of the public riders don't understand what we actually do each and every day. The work and the effort that goes into moving those trains and buses.
Right.
Track workers, track supervisors, supervising that the track gets done in the middle of the night when there's less passengers on the train, so that the trains during the rush hours can move faster,
Right.
or move and stay on time.
Right.
Okay. And yes, we do move everybody in New York City, and that comes from criminals down to the doctors and lawyers that are
Right.
going to work each and every day,
Yeah.
and your members and
Yep.
across the board. And yes, the trains have to be on time, and my members and other union members are there to make sure that this happens on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. It does. That correlation I draw often because, again, we're focused on the show about a lot of things related to the criminal justice system, but the criminal justice system can actually be directly affected by the quality of the transportation system here in New York. And we rely on you guys rely on us. It's a symbiotic relationship, but I think that some of the issues going on are far above the day-to-day rank and file workers at the MTA. There's a lot of things going on above in the ivory tower, as we like to say sometimes. And so if you stick with me through a quick break, I'd like to get into some of that stuff and just the future of how your union is. All right? Justice Matters will be right back after this message.
Bringing a fresh new perspective on the challenges and issues that face our criminal justice system and their impact on all New Yorkers, this is Justice Matters with your host, President of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association, Patrick Cullen.
Welcome back to Justice Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Mike Karubi, President of the Subway Surface Supervisors Association, also known as SSSA, right, Mike? You've built a reputation as a no-nonsense labor leader, and you really have gotten things done on behalf of your members. Tell us about some of the biggest accomplishments that you and your team have accomplished on behalf of your members.
Well, Pat, when we took over this union in 2015, we did something that was very unprecedented in labor, and maybe you can attest to this. We cut salaries of all our staff by 50%.
Yeah.
I took a 50% pay cut. Didn't matter. We came in. We provided union representation around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Right.
We went to work right away on the MTA, going after them, telling them that this is no nonsense anymore. This is how you're going to do things, and we're here, and we're not going away. We also began our fight up in Albany, and I have to tell you, Pat, I'll be honest with you, when I went up to Albany on many stints up there in the early days when I first took over, a lot of the politicians didn't even know who we were.
Right.
When we mentioned the union, they were like, who? And that was kind of belittling. It was kind of sad that the prior administrations, to me, didn't do anything for many, many years.
Sure.
And thank God today, politicians know who we are. The politicians in the city and state and across the board know exactly who the SSSA are and what we're looking for and who we represent and what those membership need to get in the future under the legislation.
I can personally attest to that when you were elected and your board started to come up to Albany, because I was in a similar position. And we really have a footprint in Albany before my team's election. And now 3 terms in, I'm in Albany a lot, and who do I see up there? I see the same faces, and you're one of them. And it's really a testament to the work you put in, because again, it's not easy, but when you absolutely have to dedicate yourself 100% to this type of work, and you recognize, just as one labor leader to another, you recognize who is putting in that 100%.
Yes.
And I don't care if somebody else in another union's not putting in the 100%. All I know is I'm putting in my 100, and I can tell who's putting in the 100 as well.
Right.
So it is so important to build relationships. And so I think that's probably a huge accomplishment for you. It was a huge accomplishment for me to be able to communicate with our elected officials and their staffs.
Yes, without a doubt.
And their staffs.
Yes.
It's a huge accomplishment. It's a huge resource to learn, help educate your members, but also fight for the things that are important to us. And what might be important to a member of SSSA might not be important to a member of SCOA. But there are certainly a lot of places where we have common ground.
Without a doubt. Definitely have common ground.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And part of that was through a couple of different fights that a lot of groups coalesced upon a few years back. Number one being the call for a constitutional convention for the first time in, I believe, 50 some odd years. And then this idea of divesting from the pension fund to create from fossil fuel investments in the pension fund to create a cleaner environment. I'm proud to stand with so many labor leaders on those issues. Why did you get so involved in those issues?
I'll tell you, Pat, when they were trying to open up the Constitution changes, we saw that by doing that, yes, it was a long time, probably somewhat in the neighborhood of 50 years, I think they said,
50,
right? Yeah. When they were trying to do that, we knew right off the top that there'd be many, many problems with that. Some of these private citizens, well-to-do, that were going to be on these panels or whatever they were calling them, they were going to change things and would have affected our membership across the board.
Right.
Whether it be the AAA, whether it be SCOA, whether it be the corrections union, it didn't matter what union you belonged to.
Right.
The blue-collar worker was going to get hurt here. So we band together with your union and other unions across the city and state to try to stop this. And thank God it didn't go through.
Yeah,
we accomplished a big task there.
Tremendous success.
Thanks to our membership who got out there and did what they had to do as well. In regards to divestment, the divestment is a problem. Okay, we understand the fossil fuel and we understand the green. Okay, the world is going in this green direction.
Right.
I'm not too sure if I agree with that. All right, I'll be very honest with you. I understand we have to change some things here.
Right.
But to me, they haven't proved enough to me. But okay, if the state controller and the city council wants to divest some money, you can't divest all the money out of fossil fuel and put it into green.
Right.
Because the losses that we're going to sustain from the lack of green right now.
Right.
Green right now, it's going to take at least 15 years, maybe longer, to get back that money that we now get from the fossil fuel, and we're going to lose in the pension systems. If you want to divert a little bit and test it, we call it the pilot program, then go ahead and do that.
Right.
But you can't take our pension money and do this. And a lot of our members, I don't know about your members, Pat, but I know my members don't understand this, that as a labor leader in this city and state, that we have to be on top of these things. Now, some would say, well, why are you getting involved with that? Well, you have to, because this affects our pension.
Right.
We don't want you to be retired, and all of a sudden you get a letter in the mail, and what just happened a couple of years ago with the old Sears and Roebuck, right? Their pension, the members over there received letters that their pension was going to be null and void.
Yeah.
We can't have that. So as a labor leader in this city and state, we have to be on top of things like this.
Yeah, it's a tremendous responsibility, but I know, you are, I am, a lot of other people are up to the challenge. And I think it's important with the the fossil fuel / climate change, green versus dirty, whatever you want to call it. And, that's an energy argument. No, it's a pension argument. For us, it's about the money that we have entrusted to be invested for us in retirement so that we can continue a modest way of life that we've become accustomed to. Nobody is going to become a millionaire from their pension, but we are going to be rewarded for the service we've given to, whether it be the city, the state, local municipality. And I think that that's important. You're right. Now it's up to us too to educate people a little bit more on it, which I've tried to do. And a lot of people don't want to hear about fossil fuel, and then they say, well, this can affect your pension. Same thing with the Constitutional Convention. Well, really, what does it matter? Well, your pension might be, the pension system might be opened up or changed. Oh, well, I'll listen up then.
Yes.
People still have the magnets on the back of their cars from that.
Without a doubt.
You know what I mean? So it really it's still effective to this day. Hopefully they'll be on there in 20 more years and we have to worry about it again. But, all right, so let's move on specifically to the MTA. And there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of the MTA, and I think, you're directly involved with it. We read a lot about it. We see a lot about it on the news, but you're in the trenches here, Mike. So, they're blaming financial distress, and they're trying to use poor financial condition as leverage in future contract talks with you and some of the other transit unions. Let's talk about. Let's just get your take on this from top to bottom. How did we get here? Where are we going?
Yeah, Pat, I've been involved with the New York City Transit for almost 30 years now.
Yeah.
And 27 of those years I've been involved in one union or another. Okay. This to me has always been a tactic of the MTA. They always cry poverty. Okay, but yet they misspend, they misappropriate.
Right.
And I'm going to say something here, Pat. About a year and a half ago, when Mr. Byford, Andy Byford, came in, I talk with him. I meet with him. He's a decent man. I think I think he means well to some degree.
Sure.
I don't think his plan is correct.
Right.
He right away came in. He wanted to make changes here, and all of a sudden he promotes and creates these new titles as executive vice presidents of departments, which came with a pay raise. So if we're talking about cutting spending, you need to cut spending at the top levels of management. You just can't say we're going to cut overtime, we're going to cut jobs at the lower levels where it affects my members and other union members on the property. You need to start at the top.
Sure.
And I don't buy into the we're broke syndrome. All right, we're talking about millions and millions of riders each and every day riding the subway system who are paying our fares, and the fares keep going up, by the way. And the MTA is a bigger entity. The MTA gets money from tolls and bridges and whatnot. There's a lot of money there.
Yeah.
Okay, but they cry poverty, and I believe what's happening is they do this during contract times because they try to present. We're going to give you a zero. Pat, I have to say this: when I go back next year in July of 2020, I know that they're going to present something like that,
Right.
and I will never take a zero.
Right. That's that's a stance that unfortunately, bargaining and pattern bargaining and things like that have forced small unions to have to deal with that over time. But you're right. These types of things always come up as a tactic around contract negotiation times, right?
Yes.
And unfortunately, just to tie it into the justice and criminal justice side of things, they're talking about $8 billion at least to build new community jails. I believe I've seen figures as high as like $50 billion to kind of like refurbish the transit system from top to bottom. I mean, that $60 billion, where are we getting that from? When people are leaving New York because it's not affordable to live here anymore.
100%.
It's crazy. So going forward, what are some of your goals for SSSA?
Well, Pat, we have another contract coming up next year. I'd like to build on what we brought back this year. We have a couple items that, of course, we couldn't get at the table, and I plan to get those in the next round of bargaining. Definitely like to get back up into Albany, try to get some bills passed. One is the death gamble bill for a lot of our members.
Yes.
That's big on my list of bills I'd like to get. The lung and heart bill. A lot of my members pass away from heart disease and transit. Lung disease, of course, we inhale steel dust each and every night on some of my divisions.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get some of them items passed. Of course, like I said, just building a stronger base up in Albany, providing more for my members, and getting a better contract than we just recently got.
Yeah, listen, I can tell you it's been a pleasure to work alongside you on a number of issues, and going forward, I think there are certainly places where we can find that common ground again, because when you have people of like-minded nature and really, I don't want to say no nonsense, but we got to take a stand at some point. You're one of those guys. I'm proud to stand next to you as a labor leader in this city, and we could probably go on for about another half hour on transit topics.
Yes.
So come back anytime, and we can kind of delve even a little bit more into it. But I wish you luck going forward, and anything we can do to continue to support SSSA will be there.
Pat, thank you very much. Same to you, brother.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for coming on. Justice Matters will be right back after this.
Welcome back to Justice Matters with your host, Patrick Cullen, president of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association.
Welcome back to Justice Matters. In the second half of this week's show, our guest is Michael Skelly. He's a strategist, founder, and president of Skelly Strategic Solutions. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for having me.
No problem. It's good to see you. We've worked in the same space for a period of time now on some difficult issues. Let's get into some of what's going on in New York, because I think, I never like to paint with a broad brush on this show. We'd like to get into topics that matter about, criminal justice and how it affects and how some other aspects of public life affect our membership. But, you're somebody who's plugged into an awful lot on the city level, on the state level, and even outside of New York. And so I wanted to have you on to make sure we could kind of look at some of the big picture items that are coming down. But before we do that, introduce yourself to the audience and let us know what is Skelly Strategic Solutions all about.
Sure. So I formed my public relations firm 5 years ago with a specific goal of helping labor unions, law enforcement unions, nonprofits, or professional service firms navigate the complex media market that's out there, craft their messages, disseminate their messages to their respective audiences, and enhance their brands. And really, I'm very fortunate that most of my clients are public sector labor leaders and labor unions who are in the law enforcement space.
Right. And so what's attractive about working in that, not just the organized labor space, but then also like the law enforcement sandbox, which is even more, separated from the organized labor space in general?
I think what's attractive is, given the climate we're in, as far as the law enforcement community, public sector, labor community, what we're doing now, the vigorous advocacy that you're doing, other labor leaders like you, and I'm privileged to help you in that regard. What we're doing is so much more important now than it's ever been. Labor unions are attacked all over the country, even in New York. Your public pension systems are always on the chopping block. There's folks in Albany and New York City and management who always want you guys to do more for less.
Right.
And, they leverage fear in the public perception to do negotiations with you guys to hurt you. And so I think it's attractive for me to come in and really serve at the forefront of defending you from those attacks, explaining to the public the importance of what your members do and other union members, and explaining to the public how vital those services are for their day-to-day lives.
Right, right. And that is really, a major topic that we take up at SCOA is to try and let the public know, because obviously, I've said on this program many times that everybody comes in contact with the court system at some time or another. It's important to know, number one, how safe they are or how safe they are not, and what you can expect. And now with a lot of changes going forward and some of the reforms, and we'll talk about that a little later here in the segment, that's becoming more challenging. And because it's a more challenging atmosphere, it's becoming a little easier to let the public know that, hey, there are some complexities around how you engage with the court system. And
Absolutely.
so I think that's something that really speaks to what you just mentioned. What's not attractive about working in organized labor / law enforcement sandbox, as they say?
I think that there's always obviously going to be challenges in terms of the advocacy you do, the fight you make in the press to get reporters of the media to cover you fairly.
Right.
So I think, it's always a challenge when you're dealing with reporters that come to these stories and come to the coverage with a certain level of bias.
Right.
There's an inherent bias I find in my 20 years of doing public relations, an inherent bias against law enforcement, an inherent bias against labor. And it comes from a place where I think we've moved in a society where the media and the public doesn't have that same value that they used to have.
Yeah.
And I think it's up to folks like you and your colleagues to push back and reaffirm in the public eye just how critical the work you do is. You don't take these jobs to get rich. You take it to a pathway to the middle class, and that's what it's all about.
Right.
Your pensions aren't some gold treasure, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Certainly not. Certainly not. And I think, the incident that I referenced at the top of the show today speaks a lot to what you're speaking about. Now, have we encountered a little pushback from the media, whether it be reporters or stations, whatever it might be, shows? Sure. But when we found out about the incident that I earlier referenced, there was a level of disbelief. Well, what do you mean there's no court officers in the courthouse when the doors are open? Yeah, that's what's happening. And so, we had to bridge the gap over the incredulity of the entire thing. Right. And so that is something that, you have to that's a hurdle. And that speaks to exactly what you're talking about. The I hate to say inherent bias, but the unsuredness of how sturdy a story or an argument or a stance or a topic might be.
Yes.
From the public perspective, what do you view as the biggest problem with our public institutions?
I think our public institutions are going to a place where they're not valuing the work that your members do and other union workers. It seems like they think that we could be easily written off. We'll accept zero. We'll be divided, and so they can conquer. So I think that it's really up to labor to fight back and to get the public back on their side, to get the employment rights they deserve, the safety they deserve, and the contracts they deserve. And if you sit idly by, the management will just walk right over you.
Yeah, that's that's kind of always been, that's the narrative that's thread through 40, 50, 60, 80 years of union work here in the city, that, we try to say, no, we're not going to stand for this anymore. But the divide and conquer strategy has worked time and again. And if you shorten the ability of a management, an institution, to be able to do that, I think it helps. But it's baby steps.
Right. And I think, just if I could jump in,
Yeah,
I
sure.
think a point you were referencing with your previous guest, Mr. Karubi, was the effectiveness of labor banding together on critical issues all over the state, from the con to divestment.
Yep.
And I think what you have as your biggest piece of leverage is the collective strength of your advocacy, whether you're a uniform labor leader or a non-uniform, whatever sector you are. Labor has power in numbers.
Right.
And whenever labor throughout history has banded together to fight the fights, they've won.
Yes, you're right. So that model is there. It's a matter of getting buy-in. There is turnover, especially in the smaller union groups of leadership, and so people are coming in lagging behind, not knowing what's to do. But I think it's incumbent upon our longtime labor leaders, people who've been around for about a half of a decade or more, or 2 decades, to educate newer labor, not just presidents of labor unions, vice presidents, and everybody on executive boards, down to delegates, to be honest with you, so that the message flows out a lot easier. But if we're not standing together on the major topics, then we're in trouble.
Yeah,
and
I think
the minute that happens, we better start making a plan that's better than the one we have now.
I don't think you could be more right. I mean, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for unions like yourself moving forward, is training and shaping the next generation of leaders. Because folks in your generation, a little bit before you guys have a great perspective on history.
Right.
And how far labor has come. And now you're dealing with a new generation. They call them millennials. They call them Gen X.
Yep.
And the true test will be to see if they could carry the torch.
Yeah, well, whatever you might label a group of people, I think if you're engaged in your employment and you care about what it is you're doing every single day between, hour A and hour B, and how the benefits can help you and your family live a bit of a better life, then you are ahead of the curve. It's the just give me my paycheck every 2 weeks and I'm a happy camper.
Right.
And I think, I don't want to label groups of people, but there is a younger generation here who is not connected in that way. They're disengaged. And so that's why it's so important that, and you'll hear me say it on this program, I've said it many times before, our strategy is always to engage on so many platforms. Speak to what you think is the future of, or the present state of social media and multiple platforms, and how you engage people in general, but especially when it comes to labor.
Sure. So sadly, I think the days of picking up a newspaper, print of the newsstands is coming to an end.
Yeah. It's unfortunate.
Exactly. And more media companies are consolidating, and they're laying off veteran reporters, journalists who know the court officers beat, know the transit beat, know politics and labor, and they're hiring people who will just accept the lowest possible wage, not really familiar with the complexities of a story.
Yeah.
And it's important to have your side covered in that story. So I think more and more, to get with the times, unions are going to have to leverage social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, make contacts with bloggers, folks who aren't typical journalists but have influence over the digital airwaves, so to speak.
Yeah.
And to use platforms like you're doing right now. The radio station has a very wide reach, captive audience. More and more union leaders who are at the forefront of advocacy are doing what you're doing. So that's all important stuff.
Yes, and we're so proud to be able to do something that not a lot of labor unions are doing, only a handful, if that, to be able to bring people like yourself on, and all the previous guests that we've had, and really tell their side of the story, and really match it up to what is affecting us in our employment, in our union, our membership, and things like that. So I appreciate that. And with the social media aspect, I mean, upon my election 7 years ago, it was one of my number one goals was to create a zero gap environment. You cannot any longer say, I didn't know about something.
Right.
Because it's posted in your workplace.
Right.
It's on our website. It's on Facebook. It's on Twitter. It's on Instagram.
Right.
And then we email it to you.
Right.
The excuses of I didn't know don't exist anymore, or they shouldn't.
Right.
They may still, but it's incumbent now upon the member to pay attention to any one of those 6 or 7 different platforms to become engaged about an event, about just news, about what's coming up, what to look forward to, good news or bad.
Right.
And we're fortunate to do it. And that, again, was one of my number one priorities, and we're there. I'd like to take a quick break. If you stick with me, Mike,
Sure.
I'd like to get into a couple of and there's a lot lately, a lot of real specific items and issues that are coming down the pike that are really going to affect not just court officers, civil servants, and really the general public. So
Sure.
if you stick around, Justice Matters will be back right after this.
This is Justice Matters with Patrick Cullen, president of the New York State Supreme Court Officers Association.
Welcome back to Justice Matters. Thanks again for joining us. Joining us in the studio here is Mike Skelly, president, founder of Skelly Strategic Solutions. And we earlier were talking about some big picture items about, how unions can engage with members and also members of the general public. In the second half of this episode, I really would like to get into a little bit of some of the specific problems that we're going to face here if we're not already facing them coming down. So I don't want to say rapid fire, but, in the few minutes we have left, we have some topics here. Give me what you're thinking and what you think maybe how it might affect some of the labor unions here in New York City. I think that let me start with this one. Raise the age of criminal responsibility legislation is now fully underway. 17-year-olds were included as of October 1st of this year. I know you've worked in the past with some corrections groups.
Correct.
But what's the take on it there? With the raise the age and how it's affected? I believe Horizons was affected and things like that. Speak to that.
So, I think with all these things, whether it's raise the age, bail reform, criminal justice reform is one of the biggest issues now impacting New York City, New York State, and frankly, around the country.
Right.
You hear a lot in the media about it. You hear a lot of noise, unfortunately, mostly from the advocate side,
Right.
That has skewed editorials, that has manipulated information to the public, and has sort of painted a different picture that really exists for your members providing safety and security in the courts, correction officers providing safety and security in the jails, police officers providing safety and security in the streets. So now more than ever, it's important for these organizations to offer their perspective, their voice in these ongoing debates.
Right.
So, particularly with Raise the Age, that's going to obviously affect how our court systems adjudicate cases. It's going to reshape our criminal justice system. And certainly with bail reform, that's already showing to be problematic. For example, you have violent inmates being bailed out at Rikers Island, and guess what they're doing? 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, they go back to the community, they commit the same crime again.
Right.
And so I think that the criminal justice advocates and think tanks have sold us a bit of goods and have tried to pretend that this ideology of reform is really the best thing for everyone when it's not.
Right. What happens then? And we can fold in the closing of Rikers Island, recently voted on by the city council, as well to this kind of group of 3 major reforms here in New York. What happens then when we return to what would be called, quote unquote, the bad old days?
Right.
What happens then? Do I think less and less people are going to want to get involved in criminal justice as a career from the law enforcement
Sure.
side? Why would you want to?
Well, there's two. You're exactly right. And there's 2 problems with that. One is, like you just said, first, increasingly, middle-class families, families we come from, they're going to increasingly feel less safe in their communities. They're not going to want to raise their kids in these communities.
Right.
So you're going to have people leaving the state and leaving the city, which they're already doing.
Right.
And then, like you just said, why should anyone be a correction officer, a police officer, a court officer if every day you're going to be demonized in the media?
Right.
And if you're going to have people who protest at City Hall giving fuel to why you should be either assaulted in the courts, assaulted in the jails, or doused with buckets of water. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to conceive where we've come to.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a time where things really, law enforcement in the city had a tough time 30 years ago. And, some folks, cured that from the police department level and even some city council members. There was an accountability. Now it's under attack all the time. Uniformed personnel. And by the way, when I say uniformed personnel, it's not just law enforcement. I'm talking about sanitation,
Yes,
and parks department employees.
Absolutely.
Anybody with a uniform is viewed as some kind of villain.
Right.
When in reality, and I've said this before, is just the guy who lives next door to you.
Right.
You see him in the supermarket over the weekend, right?
Right.
But because the guy or woman goes and puts a uniform on to go to work, they're villain. They're villains. I don't understand how we got to this point and how we got there so quickly. But I know that all the unions and I know a lot of law enforcement advocacy groups are working to try and make sure that we are at least prepared
Right.
for maybe a real downturn in public safety, which again is kind of a downturn in the city. Period.
Right.
Just to feel like
Right.
that the general feel of the city is already kind of starting to be different. I feel like.
You're absolutely right, and I think we also have to think about accountability. The public, we're all responsible for the decisions we make on Election Day.
Yes.
Election Day is coming up next week in many races around the city and the state and Long Island. And elections have consequences.
Yes.
And all the policies that are coming down that are detrimental to folks like you, other folks I represent, that's a product of the people who the public elected.
Right.
And if we keep perpetuating that type of mentality, we're in serious trouble.
Yeah, so it's incumbent upon all of us, but I think because of the consequences elections have, unions are really responsible for letting their members know who to vote for, who is going to have your back in whatever legislative chamber it might be, even if it's a local municipality somewhere in upstate or Long Island where they're making those decisions. It's on us to make sure our members know who they should be voting for. Because we go through an intense vetting process. And I'm
Absolutely.
Sure, yeah. So
absolutely. And we were touching upon earlier about the power of numbers.
yeah.
When union members turn out, when they get their family members, their neighbors to turn out, they can elect the people in office who will have their back. And that's something we have to be very focused on.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many more issues, and we probably won't have time to get into them. Potentially the entire court system consolidating, marijuana debate continues. I think it's going to be that and 50A are going to be
Yes.
massive topics come January 1st when they reconvene. Any quick thoughts on it?
Well, certainly 50A is another example of how far left we've drifted to now allow the personnel records of police officers, correction officers, your officers, more of that information to be available and put in the wrong hands. You're putting people's lives at risk.
No question.
And it's very scary, and that's why you see so many groups pushing back.
Yeah, that's a massive topic we're going to be engaged in fully, myself, in Albany come January. Marijuana debate, I almost think it's a fait accompli at this point. It's just a matter of how it's going to look. I personally think it needs to have a labor carve-out in
Yes.
there. How are we going to be looking at
Right.
the use of legal marijuana in your employment, as it may relate to your employment? There has to
Absolutely.
be some kind of carve-out there. And then the court consolidation, I think we're going to wind up at some point doing an entire show on that.
Yeah.
Early stages.
Right.
Right, Mike?
Right. So obviously, we're waiting to see the full details of the plans. But obviously, times are changing, and we're not living in a static world.
So, Mike, if anybody wanted to get in touch with you, how could they do so?
Thanks, Pat. Sure. So they can reach me at my office at 929-600-5633. That's 929-600-5633. Or they could email me at michael@scaleystrategicsolutions.com, and I'd be happy to help.
Mike, thanks for coming on.
Thank you,
I really
Pat.
appreciate it. Great topic of conversation today.
Thank you.
As I always say, you can contact me at Cullen, CULLEN, at nysscoa.org for any feedback, positive or negative. I want to hear from you. If you've missed any of the previous shows, you can find them on our website, nysscoa.org, Facebook, Twitter. But you can also get them on the AM 970 app. Most importantly, before we leave you for this week, Tuesday's Election Day. And like I just spoke with Mr. Skelly here about, it's maybe as important as ever to become engaged at the ballot box. These are critical times going forward. And I'm speaking directly to the SCOA membership and retirees at this point, and all union members who may be tuning in. Now is the time to start acting at the ballot box. We have to do it before it's too late. Don't forget to vote. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Justice Matters. Thanks for tuning in.